Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to World History. Today we're going to talk about the end of the Reign of Terror, the fall of Maximilian Robespierre, and the rise of the French Directory and a young Corsican general named Napoleon Bonaparte. So, let's get started. Here are our objectives for today, and let's dive into our narrative. So, when we last left our heroes, the reign of terror was commencing. Maximilian Robespierre was throwing people in jail to try to create his Republic of Virtue, and during the Great Terror was executing anyone who disagreed with him. Here's an account of what it was like to live during this time period, and if you had to guess how the average French person felt about the continuing reign of terror and the creation of the Republic of Virtue, yeah, not super thrilled. So, pause, answer the questions about this, and then let's move on. All of this led to a movement against Robespierre. The conspirators had to act quickly, knowing that if there was any suspicion cast upon them, they'd be shaved with the national razor before they had an opportunity to move. So they planned in secret and agreed to grab Robespierre and his contemporaries and supporters in one lightning quick stroke. This move against Robespierre is known as the Thermidorian reaction. They attacked the hotel in which Robespierre was staying, and after a short siege, eventually they forced their way in. Robespierre himself attempted to commit suicide by shooting himself in the face, but he only succeeded in blowing his jaw off. And so in the end, he was captured by the revolutionaries, put on trial, and then executed. So, if you'd like nightmares, take a moment and pause and read the execution of Robespierre. And of course, if you're taking my class, you need to pause and answer the questions about it. This movement against Robespierre and the Jacobins is known as the Thermidorian reaction, and this is the phase of the French Revolution where we move back from the radical extremes and get the rise of a moderate government who's theoretically going to put less people to death. Madame la Guillotine is, of course, going nowhere, but the height of the Great Terror is at least over. And so, if we're going to be killing people, at least it's going to be for political reasons and not to establish the megalomaniacal cult of the Supreme Being. We hope. Maybe. Anyway, the government that takes over after this is another attempt at more enlightened, rational government. It creates a government called the Directory, in which there's two legislatures, a normal sort of House of Commons, and then a Chamber of Ancients, which have 250 members. In the end, the Girondins, for the most part, are going to take over the Jacobins, and it's going to be a much more moderate constitution. And they're going to, again, limit voting to property owners, disenfranchising a large portion of the French population and ensuring that this government is going to be much more moderate and much less radical. The executives and the real power behind this directory are going to be the 5 directors, which this directory gets their name. And these 5 guys are going to rule things similarly to the way that or in a similar way to the Committee of Public Safety, although hopefully with different results. Maybe. I guess we'll just have to see. The war itself is still going on. We haven't checked in a while since the levée en masse led to the massive mobilization of all of France. But the French army is starting to come into their own, and they're getting a couple new generals who are somewhat more effective. The real guy you need to know is Napoleon Bonaparte, who, after succeeding at the siege of Mantua, getting rid of or being able to save that city from France's enemies, is eventually going to be launched at the southern part of the theater and is going to start having pretty substantial success. But before he does that, young Napoleon, who came from the sort of backwater French island of Corsica, is going to have an important political role to play here because forces within Paris are rising up against the directors. You have got conservative forces, these gilded youth, the group called the Muscadins, who are former nobles who are going to form their own band of street fighters, who are going to go out into the streets with these canes that they refer to as constitutions and beat up any low-class sans-culottes who happen to show their faces. And so we've got now aristocratic and bourgeois forces doing basically the same thing. And then we're going to see a significant rising of the sans-culottes again, led by a guy named Gracchus Babeuf, who's going to declare himself the tribune of the people, pointing back to the ancient Romans. He's going to try to mobilize the lower classes of Paris and reestablish a more radical government than the Directory. So, far from cooling things down, we've still got conservatives and radicals fighting in the streets of Paris, attempting to reestablish control. And that's where Napoleon comes in. Napoleon is able to calm these things down. He's able to stop the assault on the government, the uprising of 13 Vendémiaire, and is going to, from his account, with just a whiff of grape shot or sort of light cannonballs, is going to drive away the sans-culottes and keep the Directory in power. So the Directory is now in power not necessarily because of their popular support, but because they have the backing of the army, and this is going to be a constant theme throughout the French Revolution. Whoever has the army on their side, whoever's got a preponderance of force, is going to stay in control from here on out. So the Muscadins and the army are now going to keep the Directory in power and prevent more radical forces from taking over. Here are Napoleon and his troops firing on the citizens of Paris and forcing them to leave the Directory in power. Napoleon is then going to launch his army across the Alps and launch a lightning campaign against Italy. The Italian city-states were controlled by the Austrians, and so this was seen as an opportunity to strike a key blow against Napoleon's Austrian forces. Napoleon has this heroic painting of him crossing the Alps on a horse, despite the fact that he probably crossed on a donkey. He's got this heroic painting made of him leading the charge across a bridge in order to win a key battle, when in reality, I'm sure he was almost certainly leading from the rear. And so from this early stage, Napoleon is already starting to build a sort of mythologized history of his actions to become a larger-than-life hero to the French and gain a lot of popular support. Napoleon is also a military genius who has great skill in using new tactics. For example, holding an enemy force in place and launching smaller groups to outflank them. This is called the attack on the rear. Also, the strategy of the central position. Napoleon is very good at splitting his enemy into two chunks, holding one chunk in place with a small force while crushing one army with his larger force, and then turning and taking out the second, almost equally sized force. So he's great at splitting his enemies and attacking from places in which they didn't expect. And so he launches a lightning campaign, chasing the Austrian forces all the way across Italy and eventually even taking Vienna. Here's his Napoleon's proclamation to his troops. So take a moment to pause, read, and respond. Hopefully you can see here he's already using some Enlightenment philosophy to help support his troops and using the value of spreading the French Revolution to try to hopefully pacify the territories that he's conquered. And after taking Vienna, he forces his enemies to sign the Treaty of Campo Formio, which is going to create a bunch of sister republics, these other sort of republican states across Italy, the Helvetic, the Cisalpine Republic, the Batavian Republic, the Ligurian Republic, the Roman Republic, the Parthenopean Republic. All of these states are going to be revolutionary governments that support France. And of course, they have to pay taxes to France, and Napoleon is going to be accused by his enemies of massively looting the entire Italian peninsula in order to help fund this war effort. But for the French, of course, it doesn't really matter. They now have the war is over. Napoleon is victorious. France is rich and powerful. And yeah, they've been successful on almost all fronts. Now that the Directory is in power, it's time for them to turn on their enemies. And so we get an era of directorial terror, or white terror, where the directors are going to round up former Jacobins and punish them for the reign of terror. So here's an account of the white or directorial terror. Take a moment and pause and read the questions about this. And so hopefully at this point you're having some questions about, is the Directory really a better government than the Legislative Assembly was? And to what extent has the French Revolution succeeded at this point? Now, the directors, it's time to have a new election for a set of directors, and the directors pull their first major coup. Led by a guy named Talleyrand, a French diplomat that had been around, and bishop who'd been around since the Ancien regime, the directors basically throw out any election results they don't like and ensure that all of their candidates continue to maintain power within the Directory. This coup of Floreal basically establishes that there will be no democracy in directorial France and that all elections will be fixed in order to keep the people in power. And if you don't like it, Napoleon's got some grape shot for you. So Napoleon then uses his support within the Directory to plan a massive invasion. Up until the last moment, they don't reveal where they're actually going. in order to try to hold the British in place because peace with England has still not been established at this point. But Napoleon decides instead to invade Egypt. The goal here is to expand, create colonies for France, cut England off from their valuable colonies in India. We haven't talked yet about the British colonies in India, but don't worry, we're definitely going to get into that. And so Napoleon and the French army invade Egypt. They quite easily drive out the British army. They bring with them a whole bunch of scientists and other sort of civilians in order to start excavating Egyptian tombs. They also bill this to the world as like somewhat of a scientific expedition. And so they're going to find a whole bunch of artifacts and start investigating ancient Egyptian things. And so Napoleon is going to quickly seize control of Egypt. They're also going to find the famous Rosetta Stone, which has the same text, the exact same words in Egyptian hieroglyphics, ancient Egyptian, and then also Greek, which allows Europeans to translate hieroglyphics for the first time ever. So that's very exciting. But Napoleon also has some setbacks. The amazing British Admiral Horatio Nelson is going to destroy his fleet that he used to get to Egypt. And so if Napoleon's going to succeed, he's going to have to conquer his way home the same way Caesar did back in the last days of the Roman Republic in about 50 BC. So Napoleon is now left without a fleet. The British control the Mediterranean, and he's going to have to find a way to get back from Egypt. Unfortunately, this is going to go incredibly poorly for him. He launches an invasion of the Ottoman Empire, but the Ottomans, with support from the British, are able to drive Napoleon back. Also, the bubonic plague hits French troops and devastates the French ranks, and without control over the Mediterranean, Napoleon is unable to get any reinforcements to Egypt. And so, with his troops dying of disease and with increasing resistance from the Egyptians, who honestly had never truly supported Napoleon in the first place, and who, although they maybe didn't like the Mamelukes, the sort of ruling class that Napoleon drove out, and they weren't huge fans of the Ottomans, they didn't like Napoleon all that much either. And so with increasing resistance, Napoleon decides to flee. He promises his troops that he will return with more soldiers, and he heads back for Paris. So this is where we're going to leave our heroes for today. Napoleon's troops are in Egypt, expecting his return. Napoleon is heading back to Paris at the head of after his spectacular accomplishments in Egypt, maybe. And the Directory is holding on to power only with a combination of voter fraud and the support of the army. So, sounds like a super stable situation that is absolutely not going to lead to a massive military coup tomorrow. So, we'll save that story for tomorrow. Thank you for listening.